Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our lecture series in scholarly writing for publication. I want to welcome you in a special way to our lecture 6, and lecture 6 will focus on theory in a broader context of reality, knowledge, science, and research. And if you remember, in our lecture 5, we did discuss issues that relate to theory building, and it was an introductory part of theory building. And we had to do that because we know very well that research involves theory building and theory testing, ladies and gentlemen. And theory testing, the empirical part, while theory building involves the development of models from a particular context or reality out there, and then come up with the propositions, conjectures, or hypotheses that are testable, and so that conclusions can be made at the end of the day. So the results can actually lead to extensions or revisions of those particular theories. But I did tell you that in these lectures we are dealing with the theory building for hypothesis specification, ladies and gentlemen. So lecture 6 is theory in the broader context of reality, knowledge, science, and research. And in this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I will be covering two major aspects and then thereafter summarize. So we are going to look at theory in the context of reality and knowledge. So I'll be talking about actual reality, I'll be talking about knowledge, and I'll be talking about presumed reality. And those are aspects that we even covered in the previous lectures. Ladies and gentlemen, the second part that I'll be covering in this lecture will be related to theory in the context of science and research. And in this particular sense, we'll be looking at science and theory, we'll be looking at research and theory, and we'll be looking at paradigms, actual reality and theory, ladies and gentlemen. And thereafter, ladies and gentlemen, we shall come to the summary, and that will be the end. Allow me to begin, ladies and gentlemen, our lecture, and I hope you are seated and you are enjoying possibly balancing a cup of coffee and possibly your pen and notes, and we are going to exchange ideas that relate to theory building. So let's look at the theory in the context of reality and knowledge. As I have already said, science aims at generating knowledge, and research in a particular form of process is very important. So research in this case is a particular form of process of generating knowledge. And it is a process that is consistent with the features of science as a mode of developing knowledge. And research can be seen as consisting of two parts, ladies and gentlemen, as we have already seen. And the first part is theory building or conceptual research, where conjectures about reality are generated. And the second part is theory testing or empirical research, where the conjectures are subjected to empirical verification. Now, the focus of this lecture is on the first part of these two parts, namely theory building for hypothesis specification, which can be termed as the conceptual part of the research process, which can then serve as the starting point for the subsequent empirical examination part, ladies and gentlemen. And since hypothesis specification is a part of research, and research is an approach to generating knowledge about reality in a manner that is compatible with the features of science, a discussion of certain broader aspects of research becomes relevant. So these broader aspects that we're going to discuss include the nature of reality, includes knowledge, and includes science, ladies and gentlemen. So theory building, as you can see, and development of hypotheses form a part of the research process, And this lecture addresses these broader aspects. And again, I'm going to put back the figure that we had there. I hope you still remember that figure too, so that we really do understand what we are talking about. So if you can look at the screen here, figure 2, because we are continuing with the discussion that relates to that figure. That figure 2 may provide, and it does provide certainly, a helpful framework for viewing these broader aspects that we are discussing in a larger framework, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, figure 2 represents a perspective of research, and that's why you have actual reality and the term actual reality, and that's where we started. In figure 2 refers to the phenomenon in the real world that the research seeks to understand, and the term actual reality is used here to refer to some phenomenon in the real world that is sought to be studied in research. So I'm sure you are seeing that diagram too there. And one of the objectives of research is to generate knowledge about reality of the real world. However, theories may be needed as representations of actual reality for various reasons. And of course, direct observations of the real world may be too complex to develop an understanding, or they may not reveal the actual relationships existing between units of interest in the real world. So observations in such a case, although could be used in the data collection process and also trying to model reality out there, but the process might be very complicated or complex. And in such instances, developing a simplified representation of an otherwise complex reality, and ladies and gentlemen, assessing whether the predictions or conjectures derived from that simplified representation actually correspond with the observations obtained from the empirical world is one of the, it's actually one way of developing an approximate understanding of the real world. And in this process, theory building for hypothesis specification provides conjectures and predictions from simplified representations of the reality, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, once that is done, then we are able to facilitate the process of developing an understanding of that reality. And theories, ladies and gentlemen, are thus simplified representations of the real world. And an example, certainly, that we used earlier on helped us to clarify this issue. And let me just give another example here. In business management studies, for example, some phenomena of interest may not be observable, or may be observable only indirectly. For instance, if you are dealing with an employee's motivation system that influences his work behavior, this aspect of motivation system is not observable. By the way, even the behaviors of the employees are not observable. And similarly, an employee's values and commitment to the organization, and even satisfaction and so on, may not be directly observable. So hence, in this case, a researcher may first develop a simplified representation of reality of employees' organizational commitment, and from the picture that come up at the end of the day, may develop a prediction that an employee with a high organizational commitment will form positive behaviors. And subsequently, a researcher may obtain measures of commitment and positive behaviors using various observable indicators for several employees, and would then assess whether there is a very strong relationship, and again I'm talking about a relationship that is statistically significant between those particular constructs that, or the concepts or variables that the researcher is studying, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if this is found, then one relationship in the representation, and I'm talking about theory of employees' organizational commitment, that employees' organizational commitment is positively related with employee contributions to the organization is supported. And once that is done, then we have developed a partial knowledge about the reality of the effects of employees' organizational commitment. So in the process, ladies and gentlemen, the process of theory building for hypothesis specification is carried out with an objective of developing an understanding of the actual reality. So let's look at this concept of knowledge. I know it's something that I've been discussing over time, and I told you that knowledge is defined as justified true beliefs. But of course, you remember the Gettier case when we are dealing with the philosopher of science, Gettier, who challenged this kind of thinking. But anyway, without really going into that debate, while the actual reality being studied by researchers exists outside them, they develop knowledge about it. And this raises a question as to what knowledge is and what is its relationship with the actual reality and the theory. If you remember the diagram that we had here in figure 2, that is figure 2, that diagram, it can be put back, so you have actual reality, presumed reality, conjectures, and so forth. So we develop knowledge. Again, we see Kellinger in 1988 provided a description, which is very important, and Kellinger simply says that Kellinger's description indicates that to know is to form beliefs, and thus knowledge can be viewed as a set of beliefs. However, not all beliefs may constitute knowledge, as I've already said. Science seeks to generate beliefs, right, or knowledge that has certain features, and one of the definitions of science, again as cited by Stone, suggests that science seeks to develop a particular kind of knowledge, and that this knowledge is developed in a particular way. It suggests that science seeks to develop objective knowledge, and those are some of the features of science. Objective knowledge that can be supported by empirical data rather than seeking support from individual opinions, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, it further suggests that the empirical data for such support is collected by observing and experimenting in a suitable manner. And that's why you must actually provide a convincing methodology that you went through all the protocols and generate results. Now, this description that I'm giving you of the kind of knowledge sought to be generated by science indicates an emphasis on having an empirical or factual basis of the knowledge. And in the method of science, it is assumed that the objects in the real world, ladies and gentlemen, exist, and whose features exist independent of the opinions that different individuals may have of them. And the knowledge generation in science is done, ladies and gentlemen, in relation to the evidence or objective assessment of the real things. And thus, beliefs grounded in objective evidence about the objects in the real world or in objective empirical evidence can be regarded as constituting the knowledge that science seeks to generate, ladies and gentlemen. And as you can see in this view, correspondence of beliefs with the empirical world or actual reality qualifies those beliefs to be regarded as scientific knowledge. Let's just take an example. For instance, let us consider a person sitting in a room from where he cannot see what is happening outside the room. Now, that person may hold a belief at the moment that it is raining outside. However, this belief would constitute the person's knowledge or scientific knowledge about the reality only if it is actually raining outside. And therefore, in this example, the correspondence between the belief and the actual reality outside determines whether the belief constitutes knowledge or not. And the correspondence criterion used to assess whether a belief is true or not implies that there may be beliefs that do not constitute knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. For instance, a supervisor may believe that a subordinate is not committed to the organization, whereas the actual reality may be that the subordinate is actually committed to the organization. Now, in this case, the supervisor's belief may constitute perceptions of the reality rather than knowledge about reality. So science, as a process of generating knowledge, can be seen as generating belief statements about the actual world, and we call these conjectures from and about the presumed reality, and then retaining those belief statements that correspond with objectively obtained empirical evidence. So belief statements retained out of this process constitute knowledge in a scientific sense, ladies and gentlemen. And in this view, science generates knowledge as an outcome of empirical testing of the belief statements by retaining empirically validated belief statements as pieces of knowledge. So theory building activity pertains to the specification of presumed reality and conjectures, ladies and gentlemen, conjectures, parts of this knowledge generation process of science. And this activity generates plausible belief statements which are subsequently subjected to empirical verification, ladies and gentlemen. And those belief systems that get empirically supported constitute pieces of knowledge about the actual reality. So this entire process that I'm talking about, generating plausible belief statements, empirically verifying them, and retaining those statements that are empirically supported, constitute, ladies and gentlemen, the research process. And in this view, the aspects of theory building or hypothesis specification, research, knowledge, actual reality get interrelated to each other at the end of the day. So let's talk about the presumed reality. Now, while research, ladies and gentlemen, aims at generating knowledge about the actual reality, and the actual reality may not be directly accessible to the researcher, or may be too complex to discern relationships in a researcher. And of course, developing those relationships might be complicated, and therefore, at the end of the day, the researcher may end up forming what we call presumed reality. So in the process of modeling, you form those presumed realities. So from the actual reality to a presumed reality, of course, that's what you model and put on your paper. So that's what it is. So for instance, in this case, a researcher can develop a conceptual model or theory of what an employee's commitment to an organization is, what causes it, and what outcomes it has. Now, the researcher can specify or reasonably assume, for example, that commitment is an employee's particular type of attitude towards an organization. Then he can make conjectures, ladies and gentlemen, about what organizational aspects cause it. Now, he can also make conjectures about the various consequences of the employee commitment to an organization, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, this becomes very important because at the end of the day, we must go through this kind of process, right? And I think that's a good example that I've just given you, but we know very well what conjectures are, and conjectures are just tentative beliefs, and after developing them, a researcher collects data about the actual reality and assesses whether the data actually corresponds with the conjectures. Now, if it does, then the conjectures are accepted as reflecting the reality out there. And of course, each conclusion of correspondence between the conjecture and the actual reality provides an empirical fact, as I've already said, in the form of an empirically supported conjecture about the reality, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this adds one piece of knowledge to the existing reality. Now, this also strengthens the research community's confidence in the adequacy of the presumed reality in representing the actual reality. Now, this discussion suggests that presumed reality includes a set of conjectures about the actual reality. I'm sure you still see figure 2 there, because everything that I'm describing is actually presented in figure 2, which is still on the screen there. And of course, in the aforementioned discussion, the other aspects of figure 2 also become relevant, ladies and gentlemen. So therefore, some discussions of the components and processes depicted in the figure become relevant at this material time. And we can actually talk about these things. So the first component of the figure is the actual reality. And of course, a researcher seeks to develop an understanding of this. In scientific research, a researcher seeks to develop knowledge about the actual reality. For this, he can develop a plausible view of what actual reality is. And the term presumed reality is used here for the plausible view that a researcher may develop about the actual reality. And this presumed reality may take a form of a theory or a model of that reality. Now, again, since we are talking about modeling the actual reality and presumed reality, I'll ask you, ladies and gentlemen, for a more detailed understanding of modeling reality. I will ask you to go and consult my lectures on the philosophy of science in economics, lecture 13, which dealt with the models and modeling in economics, part 1, lecture 14, that handled models and modeling in economics, part 2, lecture 15, models and modeling in economics, part 3. So you will see how interesting it is. Please make sure that you attend these lectures and make sure that you understand these lectures very well, and then return to the theory building aspects here that takes us into methodology. So what I did discuss in lecture 13, 14, and 15 under philosophy of science in economics, but models and modeling, we're actually helping us to come up with the models that represent reality, and in so doing, we were dealing with the conceptual part, which forms what we call theory building. So as you can see, this is very important. Conjectures must be developed, and then at the end of the day, conjectures must be tested, ladies and gentlemen. So again, when you look at that diagram, figure 2, you see the entire research process there. So the researcher then takes out one or more of the conjectures from a theory or model, or the presumed reality, and then that researcher has to specify methods, right, that he can use to collect data relating to those conjectures, and then again the data analytical tools that he's going to use to test those conjectures, because not all of them will be tested, not all of them will be more or less framed in the same way, right, because of the nature of the reality out there. So you may find that you are going to use different analytical tools, ladies and gentlemen. So the issue of research comes in here, right? So we go ahead and obtain data using measurement tools, data collection procedures, and this data constitutes the observed reality. Observed reality is data. Now, of course, you have the other one, which is not really observed. So the observed reality is filtered through the measurement and data collection procedure of the researcher, and thus may not exactly reflect the actual reality. Now, this is acknowledged in figure 2, where the observed reality and the actual reality are depicted as two distinct parts. And then by analyzing the data, the researcher examines whether the pattern of data corresponds with a pattern specified in the conjectures from the presumed reality. And now, if there is a correspondence between the conjectures from the presumed reality and the pattern of the observed data, ladies and gentlemen, then the conjectures can be taken as empirically valid or as supported by the data. And each, right, of these conjectures that is supported by data then provides one more piece of knowledge or empirical fact about the actual reality. And these empirically supported conjectures also add to the support for the presumed reality as an adequate or reasonable representation of the actual reality. So there are several ways, ladies and gentlemen, of doing it. And one of these is to use the existing theories or presumed view of reality as outlined in the previous example that I've just given you for specifying hypotheses for empirical testing. Now, the actual process of theory building, ladies and gentlemen, that can be used for this and the other ways for generating hypotheses will be discussed later on and beyond the scope of this lecture. Now, sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, multiple hypotheses generated for empirical examination may constitute a small theoretical model because the process of specification of these hypotheses also results in the specification of several other units or components of a theory, ladies and gentlemen. So those conjectures from a theory or a model which can be taken up or are taken up for empirical verification, right? And of course, these are called hypotheses, ladies and gentlemen. So hypothesis can be seen as derived from a theory or model that, this is very important because these must be tested anyway at the end of the day. So the process of hypothesis setting may be typically preceded by theory building with an objective of developing testable conjectures or hypotheses. Now, this theory building process for hypothesis setting spans across two of the components that we see in this diagram, which is figure 2, the presumed reality and conjectures in the research process, again depicted in figure 2, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to move to theory in the context of science and research, right? So why don't we start by looking at science and theory? So again, as explained earlier, in social sciences, knowledge about actual reality is developed through a long sequence, and the steps in this sequence include developing a view of the actual reality in the form of presumed reality, deriving one or more conjectures from this view of presumed reality, ladies and gentlemen, and carrying out research for verifying whether these conjectures actually correspond with observations made about the actual reality. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you are listening to this lecture, remember, there are two things that I mentioned, and you do not forget these two, because that's why we are having a discussion about theory building. You see, when you start doing research, right, you've got reality out there, and you are seeking for explanations of that particular reality. So you start by modeling, right? And in the modeling process, you look around to see the tools that are available, and those are the theories that scholars have in the past developed to try and explain reality out there. So, and those are the nets, right? And if they can adequately capture reality out there, then you are doing a good job, ladies and gentlemen. But that may not be the case, because reality can be complex, as again represented in the lectures that I've asked you to attend in the philosophy of science, in models and modeling in economics. That's part 1, 2, and 3. That's lecture 13, 14, and 15. That's how you understand the complexities of reality. Now, in this process that we undertake, ladies and gentlemen, we know very well that we've got the theory building part, right? And that is what goes through our background or introduction, right, up to the time when we actually develop a model. Right, now you have a second part that we call the theory testing. That's when you come up with the methods, methodologies, and so forth. And then you measures, right, and the tools available to a researcher. You go measure those concepts, collect data, right, analyze data, and then at the end of the day, the results that you get, right, will be compared against the reality that exists out there, the conjectures, propositions, and the hypotheses that you develop from that modeling of reality, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what we actually do, and that's the relationship between research, ladies and gentlemen, and theory building, right? So that's very important. And of course, we know in terms of research and theory, if you look at the definition given by Stone, 1978, Stone suggests that research is examination of a real phenomenon through the adoption of methods outlined or recommended in science. And this definition can be interpreted in light of the earlier cited definitions of science. And of course, I will not really go through all those definitions because you know them, but do not forget that this process is scientific, the process is systematic, the process is objective, right? And you go through that empirical process, ladies and gentlemen. So as a process, right, that adopts methods really which are outlined and documented in the various literature, right, and as recommended in science, and methods again that are in compliance with the guidelines of science, and of course suggesting that research is a process of examining a phenomenon in an objective, systematic, and empirical manner, ladies and gentlemen. So research can be divided into two broad classes, ladies and gentlemen. We've got conceptual research and empirical research, and that's why we started in our lecture 1 and lecture 2 and lecture 3 and lecture 4 when we started looking at issues that relate to scholarly writing for publication, ladies and gentlemen. So you can have a conceptual paper and you can have an empirical paper. So these are actually related. Now when you look at the diagram, figure 2 again, which is presented here on the screen, as you can see, conceptual research focuses on developing the presumed reality and the conjectures, while empirical research focuses on the collection of data and assessment of correspondence between collected data and conjectures. And the theory can be viewed as an outcome of conceptual research, right, and a basis of empirical research that seeks to verify the implications of or even conjectures generated from the theory. And these two parts, as depicted in figure 2 that you see here on the screen, right, interconnected in that they form parts of the knowledge generation process and support each other. So theory and its conjectures coming from the conceptual part of the research guide empirical research, while outcomes of empirical research can suggest the avenue or avenues for alterations in the existing theories, which can then yield fresh conjectures, ladies and gentlemen. And this is consistent with the Ntayi 1976, who says that the entire knowledge generation process is actually cyclical. It's a cyclic process containing the parts of a theory and research, and indicates that the process up to proposition specification forms the theory or theoretical part of this cycle. And based on the preceding discussion and in light of Dubbin 1976, it can be suggested, ladies and gentlemen, that the term research in the cycle refers to subsequent empirical verification activities, including certainly deriving hypotheses from propositions and collecting data on measurable variables used in the hypothesis, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, as I have already said, Dubbin 1976 notes that these two parts of theory development and theory testing are interrelated and interlinked. And Dubbin 1976 again notes that research could take two possible approaches, right, in its task in relation to a theoretical model. It could seek to examine the proof for a theoretical model, or it could seek to improve a theoretical model. And in this sense, research could be seen as closely linked to a theory. And the guiding role of a theory in the research process is also reflected in the works of Kellinger, 1988, I think. So, and looks at the entire scientific research as a process in which a theory and the associated hypothesis about the likely nature of the empirical phenomenon guide the process. And the various discussions suggest that a theory is a significant part of the scientific research process. So you can't actually ignore a theory. You can't ignore theories. So theory building results in the depiction of a view of actual reality in the form of the presumed reality, as you can see in the diagram, and that can be used to provide a set of conjectures about what is likely to be observed in the actual reality, ladies and gentlemen. And these conjectures or implications about the actual reality derived from the theory can serve as the basis for the subsequent empirical research activity. So this is very important that we really think about the theory building and the theory testing part as really major component of research activity. So why don't we then look at paradigms, actual reality and theory? Because when you decide to model reality out there, you have a particular view, you have a particular understanding, you have a particular model, you have a particular paradigm that you are using. So in social sciences, ladies and gentlemen, our understanding of the reality is an interpretation or a construction of reality that is distinct from actual reality, and the interpretation or constructed view of reality is influenced by the view of the world or reality that a researcher adopts. And the term paradigm in this case reflects the world view or the alternative view of the reality adopted by researchers. So the term paradigm is used in various ways, right? And if you look at the works of Mackenzie and House, 1978, they suggest that paradigms are a collection of theories, laws, and procedures, instruments of research that are accepted by a number of scientists. And when you look at the works of Morgan suggests that the appropriateness of looking at paradigms as worldviews or as alternative realities. And according to Morgan, researchers make certain basic assumptions about the nature of society and the nature of knowledge, and these assumptions, ladies and gentlemen, shape their view of the social world. And the description in Morgan 1982 also suggests, not 82, in 1980, also suggests that under the influence of their worldview, researchers adopt certain metaphors to construct or interpret the reality. So those concepts that you have are actually metaphors, right? And certainly if you relate the metaphors or the concepts, you come up with propositions, ladies and gentlemen. And when you bring them up to the measurable level, then you can come up with hypotheses because you are able to vary. You are supposed to, well, you are able to look at those concepts now as variables, no longer concepts but variables, because they can easily be measured, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what it is, right? So Morgan has that perspective and that view. So as you can see, paradigms are formed by the assumptions about the actual reality and the nature of knowledge, and influencing researchers' construction of the presumed realities can be positioned as an influence on the presumed reality that we have in our figure 2, right? And figure 2 is still on the screen, ladies and gentlemen. So a researcher's construction of presumed reality is likely to reflect, right, partly the actual reality and partly the influence of a paradigm within which the researcher operates. So paradigms can be viewed as reflecting assumptions about reality and shaping the forms of presumed reality constructed in the research process, ladies and gentlemen. And these are important aspects that we need to understand, because there's a link between theories, theory building, theory testing with research, right, and then the paradigms, ladies and gentlemen. So whenever you undertake research, the issues of paradigms become very important. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to come to the end, and I give you a summary of what we have looked at. And we meet again in lecture 7, and I will continue with the idea of theory building, ladies and gentlemen. So again, ladies and gentlemen, in summary, in this lecture, we have demonstrated that a theory is part of the scientific research process. And we have also seen that scientific research process seeks to generate knowledge that is objective and based on systematically obtained empirical facts, ladies and gentlemen. We have also come to understand what this process is. And this process involves developing knowledge about actual reality. And these are the things that we do when we are developing knowledge about actual reality. We develop theories of reality. We derive and select conjectures from or implications of theory. We go ahead into collecting relevant data from the actual reality for assessing whether the reality reflected in the obtained data is consistent with the conjectures. Then assessing the correspondence between the conjectures and obtained data is an aspect that we have discussed. And then drawing conclusions as to whether or not the conjectures truly reflect the actual reality. And finally accepting as empirical facts those conjectures for which there is a correspondence between the conjectures and the data obtained from the actual reality. So again, we have seen in this lecture that these empirical facts constitute scientific knowledge about reality, right? While this process yields an empirical fact about reality, it also yields information about whether the conjectures and the theory from which these conjectures come are valid. So thus the research process generates pieces of knowledge about actual reality by using a theory as a representation of the actual reality, and it also yields conclusions, right, about how valid a representation a theory, right, or representation of a theory is to the actual reality. And in light of this, ladies and gentlemen, in light of this place of a theory, in the knowledge generation process, a theory occupies a specific place in relation to the actual reality, knowledge, science, and research. So it is, ladies and gentlemen, a constructed view of actual reality, right? An important instrument of scientific knowledge generation, an important link in the research process, an important goal of science, or an important means of facilitating the attainment of goals of science. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what we have covered, right, in this lecture. And a more detailed discussion on what a theory is and its role in the research process will be discussed later, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you very much for being attentive. I want to thank you very much for coming. I want to thank you very much for attending these series of lectures during this time. I can always say thank you very much. I wish you the best. Stay well, stay safe. Have a nice time. Bye, ladies and gentlemen.